So we're going to tackle a question that has haunted historians for decades. How did a modern, educated nation like Germany descend into the darkness of Nazi dictatorship? We're going to trace the precise steps, the warning signs that were missed that led to the total collapse of a democracy. All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the post-war chaos that left Germany incredibly vulnerable. Then, we'll zero in on the unlikely figure who took advantage of all that chaos. We'll see how his party exploded from a fringe group into a political powerhouse, and then how they systematically took apart German democracy. And finally, we'll ask, what can this dark chapter of history really teach us today? Okay, to really get how Hitler's rise was even possible, we have to rewind the clock to the end of World War I. You see, for Germany, 1918 wasn't really the end of the war. It was just the start of a new kind of fight. A fight against economic ruin, national humiliation, and complete political chaos. At the very core of all this resentment was the Treaty of Versailles, and specifically the infamous War Guilt Clause. This forced Germany to take all the blame for starting the war, which paved the way for absolutely crushing reparation payments. Now, this wasn't just some line in a treaty. For Germans, it was a deep national humiliation that created this powerful desire for revenge. And that psychological wound, it just kept getting ripped open by one economic disaster after another. First, you had hyperinflation in the early 20s that made people's life savings completely worthless, like overnight. Then, just when things were starting to look a little better, the 1929 Wall Street crash hit. It plunged Germany into the Great Depression, and by 1932, a staggering 6 million Germans had no job. It was the perfect breeding ground for radical ideas. So, in this climate of absolute fear and uncertainty, the new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, just looked weak, totally ineffective. Political gridlock was the norm. The government was so unstable, it felt like democracy itself was failing. This created a huge power vacuum, and a lot of Germans started wishing for a strong leader, someone who could just come in and restore order. Into this perfect storm of a crisis steps a figure who would, well, change the course of human history, Adolf Hitler. He didn't create Germany's problems, but he had this almost uncanny ability to see them and exploit them for his own political ambition. Now, it's really important to separate what's real from what's just myth when we talk about Hitler's origins. It's a fact he was born in Austria, not Germany, and he was decorated for his service in the German army in World War I. But a lot of the sensational rumors you might have heard, they're just that, rumors. There is zero historical evidence that his grandfather was Jewish or that his family's name was anything other than Hitler. After the war, Hitler really found his footing in the radical political scene in Munich. He was a powerful public speaker, and because of that, he quickly took over the tiny little Nazi party. In 1923, he tried to seize power by force in what's known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed, but it taught him a huge lesson. He wasn't going to overthrow democracy with guns. He was going to destroy it from the inside. He basically became a master demagogue. And what's that? Well, it's a leader who gets support by playing on people's emotions and prejudices instead of using, rational arguments. In the beer halls of Munich, his fiery speeches gave simple answers to really complex problems. And he was brilliant at pointing the finger, channeling all that public anger towards scapegoats, particularly Jewish people and communists. So that failed coup was a bit of a setback, sure. But then the Great Depression hit in 1929, and that was the opening the Nazis were waiting for. All that desperation and anger in the country was the rocket fuel they needed to go from being a fringe movement to a major political force. And just look at this chart. It tells the whole story, really. As unemployment just skyrockets, so does the Nazi share of the vote. In just 4 years, they went from being a tiny, obscure party to the single largest party in the German parliament. The connection between economic despair and political extremism, it's right there in black and white. But here's something you might not know. The Nazis' success wasn't just about big, flashy rallies. They were clever. They infiltrated the very heart of German society. Historians have found this chilling pattern. The more social clubs a town had, choirs, sports leagues, things like that, the faster the Nazi party grew. They weaponized these trusted social networks, turning friendships into a tool for radicalization. The Nazi leadership was smart about this. They knew that a quiet word from a buddy at your local club was way more persuasive than some propaganda poster. They systematically built their movement through this grassroots campaign of manipulation, one conversation at a time. Okay, so fast forward to 1933. The Nazis are the biggest party in Germany, but, and this is key, they don't have a majority. The next few months would show everyone their true plan, as they methodically and chillingly, legally, dismantled German democracy from the inside out. And this is where Germany's old-school conservative leaders made an absolutely fatal mistake. They thought they could use Hitler's popularity for their own gain, and then just push him aside. They convinced the elderly President Hindenburg to make him chancellor, thinking they could control the monster they were about to set loose. They were wrong. What happened next was just boom, boom, boom. A super fast, ruthless grab for power. A mysterious fire at the Parliament building gave Hitler the perfect excuse to suspend basic civil liberties. Then the Enabling Act basically made him a dictator. Soon after that, all other political parties were banned. And when President Hindenburg died, Hitler just merged the two top jobs, president and chancellor, and became the undisputed ruler of Germany. And this slide really shows you the devastating impact of that very first step, the Reichstag fire decree. This wasn't a minor tweak to the law. It was the total annihilation of basic human rights. Using the democratic constitution against itself, Hitler wiped out freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to gather, all in one move. And this, right here, is the really chilling part of how Hitler rose to power. This wasn't some violent coup in the streets. It was a legal one. By keeping up this appearance of legality, he confused his opponents and convinced a lot of ordinary Germans that he was restoring order, not destroying their democracy. You know, when you look back, the fall of German democracy, it wasn't a sure thing. It didn't have to happen. It was a tragedy born from a perfect storm of economic misery, political failure, and a whole series of terrible miscalculations. The warning signs were all there. They were just ignored until it was way too late. So this brings us to the big question, the one we've been building towards. What were those warning signs? Understanding these red flags isn't just some academic exercise. It's a vital lesson in how to protect our own democracies today. When you look at all the evidence, it points to this toxic cocktail of factors. It all started with economic desperation and that deep sense of national humiliation. That created the perfect environment for a charismatic demagogue who exploited people's anger, made political violence seem normal, and manipulated social networks. And the most crucial part, the mainstream political establishment completely underestimated the threat until it had already won. The story of the Weimar Republic is honestly a stark reminder that democracy is not invincible. It's fragile, it's something you have to constantly protect. And that leaves us with a vital question for our own time. Now that we know what the historical warning signs are, can we recognize and resist these dangerous patterns before they take root in our own societies?
Thanks for watching. Subscribe.